see this little bar. That's interesting. Lift off.
Still have to wait 5 seconds. Hi, everyone. Welcome today. We are going to be talking about Clean Water Act Section 401 implementation permits and optimizing water quality protection through 401 certs. Today we have Gary Sheth and Sahrye Cohen from EPA who are going to be doing the presentations. And I'm just the moderator. I just want to set a couple of ground rules. If everyone can put their names and where they're from into the chat box, that would be awesome so that we know who's here, who we're talking to. Also, if you have any questions at all, go ahead and put them in the chat box, and then our presenters will get to them at the end of the presentation. And again, sorry that we can't see you or talk face to face, but the chat box, we'll be monitoring that pretty closely. So, okay.
All right. Next slide, please.
Oh, okay.
Hi, so I'm Sahrye Cohen. I am the Wetlands Section Manager. So my section does 401 for Clean Water Act, and we also do 404, and then we do a lot of the ocean program, ocean disposal regulation as well. So I'm excited to be able to talk to you today about actually implementing 401 rule and how you can use that and use the conditions and the certification process to basically have better water quality outcomes. So the 401 rule is it implements the water quality certification process that is in the Clean Water Act. We are currently implementing the 2020 rule, and that became effective on September 11th of 2020. You might have heard, if you came to the surface water updates yesterday, that EPA is in the process of revising the 2020 rule, but currently we are still using the 2020 rule. So I want to be very clear on that. There's no new rule yet. 2020 rule is the way to go. So the 401 certification is required for any federal license or permit that may result in a discharge. And discharges are from a point source into a water of the U.S. So federally, it matters whether something is designated as a water of the U.S. And if you came to the surface water update yesterday, you know that we're also in the process of revising the definition of waters of the U.S. The 401 certification is not its own permit action. So you will not see one that is independent of another federal action, like a federal license or permit. Next slide, please. And there are some very typical permit actions or federal licenses that typically have a 401 certification. Probably the most common that we see throughout Region 9, and that I think most tribal certifying authorities will see, is the Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. And that's a permit for dredge and fill that is administered by the Corps of Engineers. So they have the regulatory authority over Section 404. You will also commonly see 401 water quality certifications with Section 402. And so those are permits that are issued by EPA. You can also see a 401 certification with FERC licenses. They're a little bit less common, but they definitely do happen out here in Region 9. These are typically for hydropower facilities or things like natural gas pipelines. So if FERC is issuing a license, they also would need a 401 if there's a discharge into a water of the U.S. And then occasionally you will see 401 certifications for other federal licenses, like a Rivers and Harbors Act Section 9 permit, which is for Coast Guard bridges, and then Section 10, which is for structures into basically navigable waters of the U.S. So those are definitely much less common. And so we're going to focus this presentation on Section 404 permits and Section 402. Next slide, please. All right, so with 401 certification, there are 4 actions that can be taken. You can deny the certification, you can waive it either intentionally or by exceeding the reasonable period of time that you have to review it, you can certify it or you can certify it with conditions. So tribes with 401 TAS are their own certifying authority. So for projects that happen on tribal lands, where tribes are the certifying authority, you will be processing the 401 certification and denying, waiving, or certifying that 401 cert. For tribes that do not have 401 TAS, EPA is the certifying authority. So a lot of folks recently got a letter from us that EPA was doing a certification for the nationwide permit program. And that's because EPA is the certifying authority on those tribal lands. Next slide, please. So let's look at the primary area where certifying authorities are involved in the 401 process. So for much of the process, the project proponent and the certifying authority are the two main actors. So the project proponent are the folks who are often called the permittees. In the 401 rule, they're called the project proponent. So they're the folks that are coming to you with an action. You know, they have a bank stabilization that needs to be done. They have a restoration project on tribal lands. They have a pipeline repair, all of those sorts of actions that discharge into a water of the U.S. That might require a 401 certification. So the very first step is a pre-filing meeting request. And this is all laid out in the 2020 rule. You as the certifying authority have the discretion of whether or not to grant a pre-filing meeting. If you don't feel that you need that opportunity, you can just let the 30 days of that pre-filing request lapse and then go into the next phase of the certification request. So once the 30 days after the pre-filing request has lapsed, the project proponent can come to you with a certification request. You then have a reasonable period of time that is up to 1 year to do your analysis and decide whether or not you are going to deny, waive, certify, or certify with conditions for that 401 certification. Next slide, please. I do want to highly encourage pre-certification meetings because this is a really important step in working through a project proponent's project, what activities might happen in that project so that you can determine how to be best protective of water quality on your tribal lands. So some of the things that you can discuss at this pre-certification meeting are the nature of the proposed project, the potential water quality effects, whether or not these folks are getting other state, tribal, or federal authorizations. So if you have a local permit authorization that's needed in addition to a federal 404 permit, you could discuss that at that point. And you can also discuss things like the anticipated timeline for construction and operation. So I found it very helpful when I'm conducting pre-certification meetings to discuss what kinds of best management practices might be used. Is someone proposing to do a bank stabilization project in the water during the rainy season? You know, maybe that's not the best time to do the project, right? So these are all things that you can hash out with the project proponent and discuss at this pre-certification meeting. So one of the questions in the chat is, can EPA add cultural resource surveys to be added as a condition to a 401 certification for a project off reservation? So EPA is the certifying authority for projects on tribal lands where tribes do not have TAS. One of the things you could do is you could use this pre-certification meeting to discuss if there are any cultural resources that might be impacted by the project, and to use kind of this time to determine whether or not there will be effects to cultural resources from the proposed project. If that's not specific enough, we can have a discussion at the end to see if I can answer your question more fully. So again, the pre-certification meeting, you can ask for additional information, and there's some really great examples out there. California, Washington State, other tribal certifying authorities have lists up on their website of information that they request for pre-certification. And I really want to encourage folks to use this time when somebody comes to you with a Section 404 permit to figure out what the project is and what the impacts are on water quality. Next slide, please. All right. The other main part of where you can have a really important impact on water quality through the 401 process when you're looking at Section 404 permits is through certification conditions. So of course you can make the decision to deny a 401 certification. You can waive it either intentionally or unintentionally by exceeding the time, or you can certify it, but you can also do certification conditions to protect water quality. And this might be useful in cases where you don't feel like the Corps' permit, for instance, if they're using a nationwide permit, if you feel like that is not protective enough of water quality. So for instance, if that project is for bank stabilization, but it doesn't have any restrictions on time of year, or it doesn't have any restrictions on whether or not the project can happen during the rainy season or when precipitation is projected. So it might be very important to protect water quality on your tribal lands for folks to not do projects that are in the water during certain times of year, either for cultural or biological resources. And so that might be a condition that you want to add to your 401 certification to be protective of your water quality and the specific aspects and standards that you have. So conditions should be specific, enforceable. They should avoid redundancy. So if that is already covered by the federal license or permit, it's not necessarily something you need to add for the 401 certification. It should fill gaps. So that example that I had where the precipitation forecast or dewatering or to be more protective of biological or cultural resources fills that gaps. And according to the 2020 rule, it must have a rationale and citation from federal, state, tribal regs, or guidance and plans. So you must have that rationale and citation, or the federal agency that is issuing that permit or license can waive that condition. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give a 404 case study. This is an example of a bridge replacement where the 404 impacts, so the impacts that are the discharge of fill into the aquatic environment are the removal of the foundations and the existing structure of the bridge. And then the project proponent is going to put new fill and rock slope protection in. They're going to excavate and regrade. And the Corps is planning to issue this as a nationwide permit 14, which is for linear transportation. So that kind of provides you with the basic idea of like what they're proposing. So when they come into you to discuss the project in your pre-certification meetings, you can discuss with them what are the potential to affect the uses and water quality. So how will this impact your standards? Will there be turbidity? When are they planning to place the fill? How much fill are they placing in the water? What kind of best management practices are they using to make sure that they don't have erosion? And this example, which is from one of the California Regional Water Quality Control Boards, the regional board decided that they needed to be more protective to reduce the impacts to water quality. So they decided to issue a conditional certification. So their conditions included kind of their standard and administrative conditions, but they also specifically had a mitigation condition to minimize disturbance and impacts. And those conditions included things like BMPs, dewatering, diversions, and kind of precipitation control. And they also had a condition that included monitoring and reporting requirements. And so I want to give you an example of a condition so you can see the various parts of it and the rationales and citations. Next slide, please. All right, so this is an example of a condition that I borrowed from one of the California Regional Water Quality Control Boards. And this is one that I'm talking about the precipitation and construction planning. So you can see that there are three parts: the condition, the rationale, and the citation. And we're going to look at those a little more closely. Next slide, please. And again, the conditional certifications are for when you want to be more protective of water quality based on your standards, your plans, and your guidance. than basically the nationwide permit or other permits or licenses issued by the federal agencies might be. So in this example, it requires the project proponent to monitor the forecast from the National Weather Service and to take certain actions when rain is predicted. So they have a timeline for during the rainy season, which is important for a lot of areas in the arid West. And they also have specifics for which erosion control measures should be in place. So again, it's specific, it's enforceable. Next slide, please. And I took this from a list of conditions, and they, for their rationale, they said that conditions 3 through 5, so this is one of the conditions 3 through 5, are necessary to ensure avoidance and minimization of impacts to waters of the state and associated beneficial uses from construction activities. So basically they're saying, we think this condition is necessary for avoidance and minimization of impacts. They could also use, for example, their rationale could be that they need to protect slopes from rain-induced surface erosion. Their rationale could be that they need to reduce turbidity because it's important for their water quality standards. And then they could also talk about other uses that you could find in Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, like aesthetics, habitat, and protection for fish and wildlife species. Next slide, please. So because the regional board chose avoidance and minimization and best practices for their rationale, they need to cite where in their regulations or guidance they have that information. So they cited their water code, and they cited the water quality control plan. And I just pulled those sections out so we can just look at them real quick. And so the section of the code is based around best management practices. And then the section of their water quality control plan for their basin plan is about erosion and sediment control. So you can see how those tie directly to the condition they want, which is monitoring the rain forecast so that they don't get erosion and so that best management practices are in place. So that's just kind of an example of what you can do for a Section 404 permit. When that comes in, you can use your pre-certification meeting to discuss the project, to figure out kind of what the impacts would be, to have like a real conversation with the project proponent about how to best do their project that's on tribal land to be protective of your water resources. And then you can also condition your water quality certification to fill in those gaps that might exist in permitting programs to be protective of water quality. And now I'm going to turn it over to Gary to talk about 402.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gary Sheth. I'm a senior permit writer in EPA Region 9, also the NPDES Permits liaison for tribal areas in Region 9. And as Sahrye mentioned, 401 certification is required to ensure that any actions, including actions by federal agencies such as the Army Corps or EPA, are fully protective of tribal waters. And as also Sahrye mentioned, this is tribes that do have TAS for 401 certification can use this authority to do that. In the case of NPDES permits, which are authorized under Section 402 of the Clean Water Act, currently no tribes have TAS for issuing those permits. So all of those permits are issued by EPA in Region 9. And we have about 40 tribal permits that are issued by EPA in Region 9. And these permits are for a discharge of pollutants or a combination of pollutants to surface waters that are waters of the U.S. And also on tribal land. So that's sort of the nexus of these permits on tribal land. Next slide, please. So, as Sahrye mentioned, there's a specific process that I think was elaborated more in depth for how the project proponents and the 401 cert authorities come up with doing the 401 cert, especially for 404 permits. In the realm of NPDES, it's slightly different. Theoretically, all those steps do apply, but because often EPA has been working closely with the tribes in issuing these permits, there are other forms of outreach that EPA does. The process, the 401 certification process, can be a little bit less elongated. It could be more truncated, basically. So, in terms of what a tribe might want to do when they're asked to issue a 401 certification for a proposed NPS permit, is to first review the permit and kind of see if it does meet basic requirements under both the Clean Water Act, under any sort of tribal water quality standards, and any other tribal law, and then decide whether or not, as Sahrye said, there's those 4 options: either deny, waive, certify, or certify with conditions. I'm going to do a little bit of a shameless plug here for a session that I'm giving tomorrow on NPDES 101. I think one of the best ways for folks at tribal agencies to understand how to look at these permits is to actually sort of understand the NPDES permitting process. So if you're interested and you haven't already signed up, I encourage you to sign up for the session tomorrow, which is at 11 o'clock in the morning. So that's one way you can sort of learn about how to do, or how NPDES permits are made or written. I guess this is, I was trying to be more like how the cookie is made or how the sausage is made, but this is how NPDES permits are written and drafted and developed. That's what I'm going to be talking about tomorrow. Another good source for learning about that is the NPDES Permit Writer's Manual, and I've included a link at the end of our presentation here to that. It's available online, so if you want to take a look at it at some point, if a permit comes before you for certification, definitely do that. As Sahrye also mentioned, the certification should include, especially under the new 2020 rule, a rationale and a citation from federal, state, or tribal RAGs guidance or plans. And I'm going to now go and talk about two permits and 2 examples of how tribes have approached and issued 401 certifications, and they can be used as sort of examples for your use in the future. So next slide. Oops, this is taking a while. There we go. So the 2 case studies that I'm going to talk about are the Shiprock Wastewater Treatment Facility, which is on Navajo, and the Upper Village of Moenkopi Wastewater Treatment Facility, which is in Hopi. And as you can see over here, the Shiprock Wastewater Treatment Facility, that's actually a picture of the Shiprock Wastewater Treatment Facility taken from an inspection. It's a traditional secondary treatment facility, and it has a treatment capacity of about 1 million gallons a day. The plant's fairly dated. It was constructed in the 70s, so it's reaching the end of its useful life and might need to be updated. But in any case, the permit that was issued to them a few years ago was based on the Navajo water quality standards, and the receiving water is the San Juan River, which obviously is the waters of the U.S., and also it's on Navajo, so it's in tribal area, and so it requires a 401 certification. And in this case, the 401 certification authority was the Navajo tribe, and specifically their Navajo Nation Environmental Protection Agency, or NEPA, that did that. So it's a typical permit. In the case of Navajo, what happens in terms of a process for seeking 401 cert is that the permittee sends in an application for either a new permit or a renewal permit in this case, and simultaneously is supposed to send in an application for 401 certification from NEPA. And actually, the Navajo Nation does actually charge the permittee a small fee for actually doing the administrative review of the permit, as well as the application, making sure that it meets, Navajo Nation water quality standards and other requirements to make sure that the permit is fully protective. The discharge from the permit does not harm tribal waters. And so they send that in. EPA, and in this case, the Navajo EPA, work closely together to draft the permit. And since they are working closely with us in drafting the permit, it's very unlikely that there would be any conditions in the permit that they don't think are protective, or the permit itself is not fully protective of their water quality standards. So they basically would issue what would be like a standard certification without conditions. And the next slide kind of shows the language that is included in most of their certifications. It says in the second paragraph, compliance with the terms and conditions of this permit will provide reasonable assurance that the permitted activity will be conducted in a manner that will not violate applicable water quality standards. And the Navajo Nation certifies that the discharge will comply and cites the Clean Water Act sections and also appropriate requirements of Navajo Nation law. This certification was issued prior to the 2020 rule that Sahrye was mentioning. So it doesn't seem, or doesn't have, the detailed sort of citation to the regs, but in its intent and gist, it is basically what is required under the 2020 rule. It cites a rationale, and it says what law, the Clean Water Act and Navajo water quality standards and other laws that the citation or the certification is based on. So that's a very standard example. Can you go back to the previous slide for a second? So the second example that I wanted to talk about was for the upper village of Hopi, which is in Hopi. And that one is also a wastewater treatment facility, but it's a very different wastewater treatment facility than the full secondary one at Shiprock. This is much newer, and it's a tertiary treatment facility, so it treats to a much higher standard. The water effluent coming out is much cleaner than what would come out of a secondary treatment facility. And the volume is also a little bit less. It's less than 200,000 gallons a year is the discharge volume, design discharge volume. And it discharges to the Moenkopi Wash, which is a water that's both the waters of the US as well as on Hopi land. So that's where the Hopi authority to issue a 401 certification comes in. And it is the Hopi standards. And you'll see over here, I said Arizona. I'll explain that later, but it's the Hopi standards that are used to write the permit. Next slide. Actually, can you go to the next slide? Yes, so it's an interesting story. Maybe I'll just kind of go over that. So Hopi wanted to use the water, since it's treated to such a high degree. They wanted to directly reuse the water for two purposes. One was for dust suppression, and the other was for direct application to fields for crops, human crops, as well as like animal feed, alfalfa, so on. And in order to do that, the permit needed to have requirements in it to make sure that no harm would be occurring to human health or to other uses from the direct use of that discharge. Now, EPA is the permitting authority. As I stated earlier, no tribe does have that, has NPDES permitting authority at this point. So EPA wrote the permit, drafted the permit, but was not, and used Hopi standards to write the permit. But there are no reuse standards in the Hopi standards at this point, or there were not at that point. I don't think they've adopted them yet either. But at that point, there were no reuse standards in the Hopi regs for reuse of the water for these purposes. So EPA was not comfortable in putting that in a permit as a requirement, and rather would rather have Hopi, who were interested in using the water in this way, include that as a condition in their 401 certification of this permit. So this is kind of an example of where, 401 certification with conditions would be even more protective of the tribal waters than the permit itself. And so the question then came up, what protective requirements should be included as conditions in the permit? And the tribe, since they didn't have their own Hopi water quality standards, might look at the neighboring jurisdiction, which happens to be Navajo, and Navajo Nation does not also have its own reuse water quality standards. So they decided to adopt and use the Arizona reuse standards, which Arizona has adopted. And the 401 certification that they issued included requirements based on that. So for instance, turbidity by filtration less than 2 NTUs, 24-hour average. So fecal coliform, no detectable 4 of the last 7 samples, daily sampling. This is all above and beyond what was in the permit itself. And so, and the 401 certification that was granted or issued to the permit made these conditions basically enforceable as any of the conditions in the permit. So this goes back to sort of the point that Sahrye was making earlier, that 401 certifications, even though they're not their own permits, can be used in conjunction with permitting actions to go maybe even above and beyond what is in a permit to ensure that tribal water quality standards are met. For your benefit, I've included links to both these examples, the permits, the fact sheets, and the 401 certification letters at the end of the presentation. So if you want to take a look at it and maybe even use them as examples, though, at this point, as we mentioned, there might be more requirements in terms of specific citations to the regs that might be needed in the certification letters. But overall, you get the gist of it, and it's a great example of how tribes can go use 401 certification authority to make sure that the water quality is protective of their waters, as well as uses that may not be or other uses that they might be interested in including, such as dust suppression, reuse of the water, or use for agricultural irrigation can be included in an NPDES permitting situation. So with that, I'm going to conclude my presentation here. If there are questions, please feel free to write them in the chat, and we'll get to them. Yeah, here are the links, including the permit writer's manual, the 2 permits, and I think Sahrye has included a link to the 2020 rule implementation materials very helpfully, so you could also check that out. And here is our contact information. The last slide, please. Yep, so that's her telephone number and email, and that's mine. And if you ever have any questions about 401 certifications and NPDES permits, feel free to just call me or send me an email. And I think Sahrye would welcome anything to do with 404 along those lines too. So that's that's all I have for now. Open it up to any questions or chat. So in the chat.
Hi, Gary. So if anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. We do have one question so far. Amanda O'Connell asks, can the EPA add a cultural resource survey that could be added as like a condition to a 401 certification for a project that is off reservation?
Yeah, I think Sahrye kind of addressed that during her talk.
I can elaborate a little bit more.
Yeah, go ahead, Sahrye.
So the conditions that are in a 401 certification, either when EPA issues it or when a tribal certifying authority issues it, have to be specific to water quality. And that's part of the reason for the rationale and citation. Again, the federal agency that is then issuing that permit, whether that's EPA with the 402 or the Corps of Engineers with the 404, can review that condition for whether or not it has something to do with water quality. So I think in this circumstance, a cultural resource survey that is not specifically tied to a water quality standard, either a guidance or a reg, might not be something that EPA as a certifying authority or a tribal certifying authority can add to their 401 certification conditions. It might be just too far removed if you don't have a way to a rationale and a citation for the direct link to water quality.
Great. Yeah, since there aren't any questions at this point, I did want to emphasize the conditions that were included in the 401 cert by Hopi were based on Arizona reuse standards. So it is possible for a tribe, even if they don't have their own water quality standards for a certain type of use, like reuse, direct reuse, to use other jurisdictions' water quality standards to, make sure that the water that's being discharged from an NPDES permitted facility on tribal land is protective of the uses, as well as the uses are something that can be done on tribal land. So I just wanted to emphasize that. So the 401 cert authority can be pretty powerful.
So I saw that there are two more questions in the chat. I'll answer kind of the quicker one. For the first, does AB 52 apply to EPA? So I assume that is the reference to Assembly Bill 52 in California for tribal consultation. No, that is a state regulation that applies to state agencies, usually when they're doing the CEQA process. But the Corps and EPA and other federal agencies have their own requirements for consultation under the Tribal Trust Responsibilities and under Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act, the National Historic Preservation Act sometimes. So if EPA, either through the 402 permit process or through a 401 process, does tribal consultation, it's under the federal government's regulations and trust responsibilities, not AB 52. There might be some circumstances where the state is issuing a permit or license according to state regulations, and we might try to coordinate with them so there are not a ton of consultation requests coming your way. But again, AB 52 is a California regulation. And then there's another question that I'm not entirely sure what it's referring to. When a landowner has to rectify violations issued to them through a CAO, how do they comply with cultural resource related issues? Gary, do you know?
Well, I think they're referring to like an administrative order of some kind, certified administrative order. Is that what I think it is? But if not, then please let me know. But if that's the case, yeah, again, I think that it comes down to what Sahrye mentioned earlier, like, in the permit itself, we can only include things that are directly related to the authority under the permit. So like for like a 402 permit, it's water, water related conditions. And I'm not sure, how it would address some of the cultural related conditions, unless they're water related, like fish consumption or something like that. But again, I think it's a more detailed question that requires probably more discussion to get you a better answer. But that's sort of my general take on it at this point. So let me know if you want to discuss further. One of the other things that I can mention right now is that as there are certain requirements and permits under state law, there are also requirements under federal law that don't apply to permits that are sort of state permits. So like there's a requirement for NPDES permits to do consultation with Fish and Wildlife Service for making sure that endangered species are not affected. So that's another thing that is part of an NPDES permit that's might be different from something that's issued by a state. Just bringing that up. And tribes might have sensitivity to certain species that they also want to bring up, but the EPA may or may not be able to address those under the ESA requirements if they're not also federally listed threatened and endangered species. But there's other options, as Sahrye mentioned. There's the government-to-government consultation that is offered under our tribal consultation policy on permits. So that's another option.
So I just wanted to add, if folks are looking for resources for kind of how to conduct your pre-certification meetings, the link on EPA's website to the 2020 implementation materials has some information about conducting pre-certification meetings, kind of reviewing certification requests, and even some information about conditions. And then also available on Region 9's 401 website are our nationwide permit. And we are just about to put up our new information for our new certification and conditions for the 41 nationwide permits when those get authorized. And those will have examples of conditions, rationales, and citations. So feel free to borrow from EPA if you think that we have good conditions, and to use those as a model for writing your own. And you can always contact the wetlands section through the 401 inbox if you have questions about the 401 process and how it's implemented. We have a relatively regular implementation work group, and we can have implementation sections in the Clean Water RTOC work group as well if questions come up about implementing the rule.
Well, I think this is a really good discussion. Thank you guys so much for your presentations. I would say too that if you guys wanted to continue your discussion, there is the water lounge. So Sahrye, that might be a good spot to put those two resources that you were talking about, or if the audience has more questions later on down the line, that's another good spot to go to. Yeah, but I think if no one has any more questions, I think we'll probably end the broadcast. Do you have anything else that you guys wanted to say?
Thank you for coming. We
Yeah,
hope you
exactly.
write
Thank you.
awesome 401 certs.